Welcome, everyone. Thanks so much for having us and for giving up some of your time to listen to me have a bit of a crack today at talking about all of this. I'll just share the screen and hopefully that'll all work. And I'll get rid of my mug because you've seen enough of that, I think. So we don't want to use up any more of the screen than we have to. So wanted to talk about what I call more so regenerative agroecology, because I think agriculture is, as a practice over the last 10,000 years, has not necessarily been regenerative. It's caused a lot of the issues that we have today. And a lot of that is in part because we have denied from our agricultural practices any understanding of ecology. So I'd like to broach that term instead and have a bit of a discussion around trees. Hang on, what have we got here? Let's get this working. Yeah, there we go. So this is where I come from. This is a continent it was called Australia by somebody. And I come from a part of the world which for well over 50,000 years has been home to the Dja Dja Wurrung people. Australia had, at the point of settlement by Europeans, over 350 nations across it. Similar to Europe, there's been a diminution of those nations over time and languages in the sort of homogeneity of progress. I'll speak to that a bit later. Regrarians is, going all a bit quick here, clicking away. Regrarians is a non-profit that works out of this area, and we work all over the world. We used to travel all over the world, but thanks to a little virus, we don't do that anymore. So fortunately, we were well set up to do everything online. So we've had an online presence in terms of trainings and in terms of our professional network since about 2015. So we're well prepared for this period. The Regrarians Handbook is one of our products that we have. It's a work in progress. It's currently at over 1,300 pages. There's 10 chapters according to the Agrarians Platform. It's a piece that is designed to help people understand and approach some of the many, many challenges that go with one of the, well, I think the most diverse industry of all, and that's agriculture or agroecology. We run a workplace, which Simon and many other people, over 3,000 members from over 78 countries, are members of. It's what you might call a social learning and professional development network. And that's really cool. And we have some pretty amazing conversations, both in app and on desktop. We also produced a film, which some of you might have heard of, which was released in 2015 and has won a number of awards. My wife, Lisa, and our daughter, Isabella, were the producers and directors of this. And if you haven't seen that, then go to polyfaces.com. It's a wonderful piece. We also, and this is what we did as a result of the pandemic, our eldest daughter, who is one of the directors of Regrarians, and our other two children who are 21 and 20, they took over with our assistance a local facility which has become an arts hub, but also a place where we represent at the table the food and the beverages that so many of regenerative agriculture, ecological producers, some of which are our clients and members, at our cafe and restaurant when it's called Creamtown. We also have a number of collab partners. It's the 3LM network, who are based in England and work across the British Isles and Ireland. The Jefferson Center for Holistic Management in California and the west coast of the United States. Agroassessor in Iberia, who are quite a large organic biodynamic agronomy firm, and Smart Soil, who are a firm here in Australia who do similar work. So the Regrarians Platform, which is what I'll talk about today, and we always look at our work and this whole space through this frame. Its lineage is that it's adapted from what some of you might have heard of, which is the Keyline scale of permanence or relative permanence. However, which was developed in 1958. Expands on these factors to be a lot more holistic and to include more triple or quadruple bottom line considerations, regulations, energy generation and storage. So the Keyline scale of permanence, when it was released in 1958 in this great book by the late great P.A. Yeomans, The Challenge of Landscape, the Development and Practice of Keyline, is and still remains one of the first books on broad-scale integrated agricultural development and management. It's a small part of the Dewey system, this one, and it's still a profound piece today in terms of how one puts together a landscape as complex as agricultural landscapes. So the Regrarians Platform, as we developed it, is what we think is the most comprehensive platform of its type in the world. And we have a number of layers. So Simon, as a landscape architect, or anyone who works in the design fields, works on layers, and so do we. So we've got a whole range of them, or 10 of them, which we'll discuss before we get to the tree discussion. So climate is the first layer. The icon relates to the climate, the meteorological climate, but also the climate between your ears, because that's really important to get an understanding on. The geography that you work within and what that leads to. Water is a layer, both for the rehydration of land and for humans, but also for the whole ecosystem. Access for people, for vehicles, etc. Forestry, which we'll talk about today, which is agroecology in general, where we're looking at all of the different living systems and their integration. Buildings and how we integrate them and how they're designed. Fencing systems, and that considers natural fencing as well, like hedgerows, etc., as well as more conventional electric fencing and so on. And then soils as a management layer of how we look at soils and how we look to treat them and to regenerate them. The economy and how we're looking, how we're going, and how that all integrates. And then the generation and storage of energy, and looking at primarily through the lens of trying to increase photosynthesis, the duration and power of photosynthesis as long as possible, but also looking at machinery and how we use fuel and what are all of the energy storage and generation challenges that are ahead of us. So when we look at our layers, we look at this by breaking them up a bit and saying, all right, well, we've got constitutional and foundation layers, we've got infrastructure and development layers, we've got management layers. And the management layers are ones where we're not developing so much as we're really doing some management. So the Regrarians platform applications throughout, in our work at least, is, well, we build on these layers to have different topics through our forums on the Regrarians workplace. We also do that through using Google Earth. We're very big promoters of the use of Google Earth because it's free and it's easy to share, and it's a fantastic resource. Anyone who's been in this game for as long as I have, which is about 30 years, would know that once upon a time it took a long time to get an aerial photo of a place. It took weeks. It cost thousands of dollars to get apps or programs that would allow you to do farm planning just measure a line or measure an area, but now we all have this access, which is really brilliant. And we also have access to a whole range of data or data such as topographic data and so on. So we're in a really exciting time when it comes to citizens being able to be involved in not only in land planning, but in the self-determination of how that land may well go forward within the frame of all that we've got going on. The other applications that we have is we have a whole library system. So we use the Regrarians Platform to help us to categorise not only our layers of conversation, but also all of our topics and all of the information that so many of our people in our network, which is a lot. This is when you open the lid on land planning and agricultural land planning, it's a really, really massive field. It's almost infinite, and there's a whole lot of information that we need to categorise and that we need to find. We try and make it as easy as possible for people to do what they're doing. And that also goes into the way that even we organise all of our file managers and so on. So the platform, let's delve into that. Black screen's never a good thing. So climate is the first thing that we look at. As it says, we're utterly, unashamedly self-determinist. We think that everything starts with the individual within a community context. That's how ecologies work, and that's how. But we believe that we believe that it's important to be interdependent as opposed to dependent. Again, following the lessons of ecology. So when we look at this layer, we're not just looking at meteorological climate, but we're also looking at the climate of you, your family, the community that you're within, the enterprises that you may well run, the culture that you're a part of and that's been passed and is informing the future, and regulations and all of that. Within that, there's a whole frame of references that we have to that. Holistic management as developed by Alan Savory and the holistic management networks over the last 40 years is really profound. That really helps people to understand where they want to go with what they're doing. We have a lot of different ways that our trainees, our alumni have expressed that over the years in saying, all right, well, this is who I am, or this is who we are. As it says here, our farm produces great quality food that our community enjoys eating. Our farm has soft, fertile soil on which the plants and animals we cultivate grow and easily and well. Nature thrives and we are rewarded financially. So, that's a really, as we would call it, a statement of purpose that you can put out there, put on your refrigerator or on your website as something to sort of say, well, this is us and this is where we're going, and maybe you want to join us too. And that's been a really powerful thing for us to nurture that transition that people have to more of a regenerative agroecology. That starts with an introduction to what it all means, which is part of what we're doing today. Understanding why we do what we do, understanding what we need to put all of that together, understanding where we're going to focus our attention and where will all of these elements that we talk about, or that we hear about, how will they all fit? When will we begin our transition? Who will be involved in all of the steps? Because this transition or these transitions take time and they'll involve different people. And how we feel about all of this? How are we checking in to make sure that we're continuing on the right path? The other part about this is, and it's been a factor that I would say is particularly European, and I suppose I can say that because I am a European ultimately, is that Europeans, at least in the Judeo-Christian period, have been very big on development. And when we look at landscapes and starting off with them. You know, if we're looking at, all right, well, here we are now, I've just been inspired, what do I do next? Well, a lot of people will immediately go to what I would call a big D development approach, as opposed to something that I prefer people to, well, at least consider strongly, and that's a big M management approach, where you consider first the role of management instead of just immediately going to development because you feel like you need to do things. You feel like tomorrow I've listened to all this tree talk, I need to go out and plant trees. Well, how about actually getting your management systems in order first before you go and reward yourself with this prospect of development? How about you manage your economy so that you understand what all of this is going to take? How about you manage your own relationships so that you can take on development? Because when you do development, development is high on innovation, and innovation has costs. It also involves people. It leads people to spend a lot of time and be seduced almost by the power of development versus perhaps spending and managing their life with their family or the other things that perhaps matter more at that point in time. It's always a big balance that I find, and is something that I need to put out there. So we also have priority checks. So one of the things that we do is we take people through a journey, and I'm not saying you have to do that, but you will have a journey and you will have a range of scenarios. And here I've got a scenario of Sarah, a partner, and 2 kids, and they've just bought a place. They're moving in there in 5 years, 3 to 5 years. It's a bit of a blank slate. It's got a couple of ponds on it or dams. It's got no roads. It's a grassy woodland. There's no house, and so on. And they still work in town, and that's where a lot of people are at. There's currently another period of rural resettlement. Part of that has been accelerated by COVID. A lot of people, both here in the United States, here in Australia, in the United States, in Europe, I keep hearing it all the time, and they keep talking to us about, I want to go out to the land because I feel safer out there. I want to, get self-sufficient, all of these sorts of things. Well, how's that actually going to take place? So one of the things that we do is take people through and have them understand, if you look at these bars as being items of interest or where one should lay priorities, when we take people through a program, we're going to go, okay, well, maybe you don't need to focus on all of these layers. Maybe there's just a few key layers that you need to focus on right now before you go jumping ahead and getting too far ahead of yourself. That's a pragmatic and practical way of going forward. So in this case, because of the aforementioned scenario, well, the first thing that we're saying is, well, maybe you need to get what you want to do more roundly finished, get that holistic context developed, get that statement of purpose developed better, understand what the rules of the game are going to be, look at the landscape and what its capability is. Yeah, there's no roads, so maybe we need to look at focusing on designing some roads, and which lead to the buildings and the fencing and the soils all being better developed. We do that first, and then maybe over the year you'll come back to, you've done some of those things. What happened there? You've done the first lot of work. Now you come back and have another crack at it, because planning doesn't ever end. I mean, you always plan, then you reap, and then you do something, and then you have to replan based on the feedback of that. And that's something that we understand. So this whole concept of master planning, as it were, I personally used to do a lot of that kind of work, but I've moved well away from it, because I realised that planning is actually an iterative and largely feedback-driven exercise, and one that has people and organisms who are on a journey, and there are different parts of that journey, and so one needs to strongly reflect that, as opposed to saying, well, here's the master plan and this is what it's going to be over the next 20 years, and you all try and fit into it. And maybe some things didn't work along the way, but don't worry, because we've got a master plan, and well, it's designed by masters and it's full of mastery. Right. Ecologies and ecosystems are way too complex, and then you add the human ecology to that, and you're dealing with enormous amounts of complexity that I think we need to push past that hubris and apply a bit more common sense to this, and a bit more of a realization that we are a perennial species. So why not behave like a perennial species and realize that the game's not all over in 10 minutes? We're not annuals. We're here for the journey. And so let's pay strong attention to that journey and the layers, as we would put it, of attention that one needs to place in priority. So another scenario, just to put it out there, because some of these might reflect on your own scenarios, is that you've been on a place for a long time. You have heard about this. You want to, as I'll put it, you want to change to regenerative, as some people would put it. You don't have any maps. You're running out of water. There's things are going wrong in that way. The pastures are no good. Houses and sheds are all good. Outbuildings, fencing need replacement, and we're losing money every year. Perhaps unfortunately a familiar scenario to some of you. So with that, yeah, we really need to get some maps organised and all of that. The necessity for us to get water sorted, because getting water sorted on a place is often a great enabler. Piped networks with the wonderful innovation that is plastic pipe. So in this context, our first priorities would be, because they're a livestock property, getting the water and fencing layers really well sorted, and getting laneways in place so that we can increase the ability to have much higher grades of management of those livestock, so that we can move our profitability up very quickly. So that would be our first priority. Nothing to do with trees or buildings or building better energy systems or anything like that. It's just about getting the base infrastructure that's holding us back in better shape. From that, in the second order, in between our programs, those people are going out and focusing on the on-ground works that go with that. And then once that's done, then we start to go, okay, well, what's the next cab off the rank? All right, well, we're still going to focus a bit on our because fencing and water systems don't just happen overnight. They take time to establish, but so too do. Now we get to looking at, all right, well, let's keep an eye on our economy, as we always have to do. But now let's start to tweak our soils a bit. Maybe now we've got a bit of ability to have seen some of the responses from our management to actually looking at putting a bit of time and effort into amending our soils with biologicals or minerals. But also come back to ourselves and say, all right, we've gone through this period of getting things sorted on the farm, the things that are really holding us back. Now we can take a breather and start to look at our climate layer and where we're at. Because sometimes it doesn't pay to sit around and dwell on what my statement of purpose is and all that flowery stuff. It's more important to just go, okay, we've got a situation, we've got to deal with it. So let's get to work. And so that's what we're trying to frame here and give people some sort of reference to. So the geographic layer is in large part about us understanding where we are, where we are in our locale, which is part of what Simon led off with the image of the valley or the plan of the valley, etc. But then coming down and zooming in onto our landscape and what it looks like, and then what its capability is. So using all of the wonderful maps that we have available and so on, understanding what geology we have, soil types, capabilities, but then also delving into understanding how do we monitor what we're doing. So we're big fans of what we call biological and landscape function analysis. It's really easy, something anybody can do with basically a 5-minute lesson and can carry on throughout life. And we use Google Earth to help us register all of that over time. The water layer, as I said, plastic pipe is I think the best use of fossil oil, and you know, I just can't stress how amazing its use is in allowing us to plumb landscapes, to be able to, you know, turn like many people have done over the last 30 years or so. You know, they've invested in plastic pipes so they don't have to use a garden hose to have irrigation systems in their gardens. We can basically now do within reasonable cost frames the same on whole farm scales. I mean, I work on properties which are anywhere between 5 hectares up to 1 million hectares, and all of those properties, we have a place for this kind of apparatus, this type of plumbing. And that also extends to us considering fire. I mean, I don't think that's as big a concern for you in England as it is or in other parts of the less brittle world, or less dryland world. But it's certainly a consideration that we have on this layer. The access layer, is road, where do roads, tracks, trails, laneways, etc., all integrate into the landscape? Realise that whenever you build a road, it's a high catchment coefficient, it has a high runoff coefficient, so it's a hard surface, it's relatively impermeable, and you'll get a lot of runoff from it, which may cause erosion damage and so on. So we use that same facility to actually build roads into the environment which actually harvest water and that control water as it runs across the landscape, because most roads have gutters, and those gutters can be used to direct water. So one of our favourite things to do is to build roads into the landscape which actually harvest water and direct those to ponds, and do so really reliably, which is particularly important and has become very, very useful to people in dryland areas in particular. The forestry layer, as I mentioned, deals with all biota and their integration. So this is, you might call the agroforestry layer, or the agroecological layer, or the living systems layer. And then it comes down to how do we do that? What sort of layouts? And that's typically framed by what sort of trees are we integrating into a landscape, and how do they all fit with it all? And the varying kinds of tree systems or shrub systems, woody plant systems that we can install, whether that's vineyards or whether that's shelter belts, savanna layouts, managing natural systems, block systems, orchards, and so on. And there's a whole array of different layouts for all of this. Then the buildings layer. So most people, when they think of buildings, they think of homes and outbuildings, especially when it comes to on farms. We also look to this layer as from the perspective of portable buildings. And portable buildings have been around for a long time. I mean, we've got some beautiful imagery of of portable chicken sheds that were built in England in the 1910s and the 1940s and throughout that period. The same in the United States and otherwise. I mean, now that we're into the tubular steel period, and we've got all of these fantastic materials, high power portable energizers and all sorts of stuff. We're able to do all manner of different portable buildings, and those portable buildings go down to not only portable abattoirs, because we have people clients and alumni who have those, but also portable sawmills and portable chicken sheds and all sorts of different portable buildings, which is a fantastic space for us to inquire upon. Fencing as a layer, again, we're in a period of great innovation. Some fantastic technologies coming out, and people doing all sorts of homespun things as well, where especially in the period of doing electric fencing. Down in the bottom left there, you can see a wooden fence around a tree. That's one of our students in Somaliland, which used to be British Somaliland, and he's been regenerating a property there, and it's been quite profound. He's using these. Electric fencing is not a technology that he can readily access, but he's been making portable corrals, which he manoeuvres his sheep and protects them from hyenas and all sorts of other animals which think that sheep are fairly tasty. And in the process, has just over a short period regenerated that landscape fantastically, such that all of these perennial grasses and other plants are coming back where before they weren't there. So we're in a very good period for all of this sort of technology to help us to, well, have it so that we can run livestock in particular through landscapes such that they mimic the wild patterns of migration. I mean, if you've got a 100-acre property or even a 2,000-acre property, that's not the natural range of the species that we husband, sheep and cattle in particular, goats. They're animals of wide spaces, and they're migratory animals, and so we have to mimic that migration, and the best way to do that is by using highly portable and flexible watering systems, but also highly flexible and portable fencing systems, all defined in their moves by something like holistic planned grazing as a framework. Soils, as I said, is a management layer, and we look at this through the lens, as I mentioned just then, of planned grazing and cropping. So what is the plan for where we're going to be, and why and how is it that we're going to, or why is it that we're going to have animals in this place at this time, and for what reason, and at what number, and so on. What is our ultimate carrying capacity? How is that all going to feed into us making decisions about where livestock are going to be, and where crops are going to be, and how they may well integrate together, and so on. But then also looking at the agronomy of all of this. I mean, we can't deny the fact that most agricultural operations are in the mineral export business. And so we need to take care of that. We need to take care of the soil biology. But where are the minerals coming from? I mean, most of the phosphorus in the world comes from the disputed territories of southern Morocco, Western Sahara. I mean, that's a finite resource. And most people talk about peak oil, but they don't talk about peak phosphorus. They don't talk about peak nitrogen. I mean, most nitrogen in the world, what has enabled our population to be as big as it is across the world, is because we artificially produce nitrogen, yet it's 78% of what we're breathing right now. So why isn't it something that we're concentrating getting out of the air for free through the agency of working with different soil biota in a period when most of that nitrogen comes from the use of the Haber-Bosch process and through the use of natural gas. So monitoring is really important. We're doing a lot of monitoring using drones, progressive drone technology, as you can see down the bottom. I'll come back to that property in a minute. So that's a pig property, the 200 hectare, 500 acre pastured pig operation. And what we've done here is progressively monitored the changes in photosynthesis activity over time. As you'll see, it's quite profound what you can do even with something as aggressive to the landscape as pigs. So there's a lot of different stuff that we're doing in the soils layer. The economy layer, this is where we're looking at, all right, well, what's it going to cost for any transition? And then what's our business going to look like? What's the marketing around all of that? What's the strategy? What's our whole value chain looking at? Like, how much of that are we going to be involved with? Because the idea of you being not only the producer, but the processor, being involved with logistics and being involved with the marketing of product to its end consumer involves a lot of different steps and a lot of work. And so one's got to look at how capable we are of doing that and what's the reward for doing so. What impact's that going to have on our family lives and so on? Or are we better off to team up with people so that we can get a better slice of the terms of trade, which are continue to diminish for agriculturalists globally. And then finally, when we look at photosynthesis, photosynthesis is the driver of all, or pretty well all of the systems that we operate. It's what nourishes us. It's what nourishes the livestock that we produce and so on. It's also a storage. It's also been the generator of the storage that we use most of the energy of, which is fossil fuel. So as we move into an era beyond fossil fuels, as so many of us are looking at, with net zero by 2050 and with the all of that sort of business, well then what's our energy mix going to look like in the future, and how's that going to be implemented in agricultural landscapes? What's the mix going to be? Are we going to have more solar farms? Are we going to be looking at more of a wood-based industry? Again, are we going to be looking at wood gasification? Are we going to be looking at biomass? And so on. What's it all going to look like? The other part of this layer is human nutrition and livestock nutrition. I'm a chef by trade. That's my actual real qualification back 35 years ago. I just happened to become involved in farm planning 30 years ago, and that's what I've been doing ever since. But it's always been important to me to have this connection between the food that we love to eat and all of the ritual and togetherness that brings as families, as social animals, but also the nutrition that comes with that. And what builds that nutrition is great soil and great systems. So that's a really big part of this. Now, many of you would have been aware or been impacted, unfortunately, by flooding in Europe this year and previous. And there's a reason for that. In large part, the reason for the flooding is because we have more bare soil than perhaps we ever have had. I mean, Europe is a temperate landscape, and temperate landscapes, if we go back 5,000 years ago or even further, before the last Pleistocene, the last glaciation and Pleistocene, then all of Europe was forested. Ice Age ends, all of Europe is forested again. And then what we've done progressively is we've decided that that's a bit hard to live with, so we can't make much of a living, and we can't eat much out of those forests, so we better clear them and practice agriculture. And we've done that, and we've done that, and we've done that. And as we've gone along, particularly in modernity, we've got very large machines, and we've decided now that it's more economic for us to put animals in sheds and produce their crops on landscapes as opposed to them being integrated. So in large part, the disintegration of agriculture has led to a decline in landscape function across the board. And so when you fly or drive across Europe and the United States and so many here in Australia and so on, you don't see as many animals out in the fields as you did once, or integrated in mixed agricultural systems. But you do see a lot of arable agriculture. And one of the reasons why Britain and Ireland have been the subject of so many other nations wanting to come and settle there over the journey has been because it's highly arable. It's a highly fertile, great climate for growing. It's just a great place of biowealth. And so the corollary of that coming forward is that we've got a lot of bare earth agriculture. And so that creates a landscape which is less permeable. and has less infiltration. So it's any wonder that we have this problem where we've almost exported Australia back to the UK, and that's where you've become a place of drought and flooding rains. I mean, I've done work. I did a workshop at the University of Coventry in 2011 on drought. I never thought in my wildest dreams that I would do a drought proofing workshop in the Midlands of the UK. I mean, that just seems insane to me. In 2009, I did drought proofing workshops in Iowa. It's a place that gets 50 inches of rainfall and has the best soil, some of the best soils in the world. And we're doing drought proofing workshops. Where is the drought? Well, the drought's in the soil. The drought's in the loss of carbon, in the fact that these soils are resistant to moisture now and resistant to landscape function. So when we look at what happens here, it's very simple. 1 millimetre of rainfall on 1 square metre is 1 litre. If you get 200 millimetres of rainfall or 8 inches of rainfall on a square metre, that's 200 litres. You get 1,000 millimetres, that's 1,000 litres on every square metre on the bit of ground, if you stand up, that you basically occupy. So, you add all of that up and we're talking about extraordinary volumes of water that's now either not available because it's not percolating, or it's running off and causing all of this flooding, and with it is going all of the soil surface. So it's a really, really big problem that we need to address. And if you're not involved in agriculture, then it's something that you need to consider through your power as a person who buys things, who buys agricultural products. I want to also discuss some of the work that some people like Peter Andrews and others are doing in terms of understanding how a better frame of landscape should be. And that's where, and some of you will have seen this already, that, when you look at, really good, what I'll call landscape harmony, it's where you've got the hills have some sort of forest, whether that's closed canopy or more open savanna forest systems on them. On hills, the soils are shallower and they're typically more of a water and nutrient recharge zone. And then you've got the foothills, and you've got coming down towards the floodplain is where you've got ideally the agricultural zone, and you've got this movement of animals moving up as vectors or movers of nutrient, and getting that nutrient movement up and down the slope, all the way practicing forms of agriculture which have infiltration, rainfall infiltration as a primary focus. And then we have these riparian zones. So when we talk about the river, that river system and the creeks and all of that lead to it, those riparian systems, then what sort of protections are we placing in them to keep them so that we've got this recovery, so that we've got this protection, so that we're developing these as some of the last and strongest bastions of wildland ecologies in what we've got. I mean, it's very difficult for us to imagine that we could completely rewild a place, which is, thanks to the likes of George Monbiot and others, is a theme that's out there at the moment. I mean, if we were to do that, then I would say that there's a population outcome just from the fact that we're just not producing the food. So where do we go, and how do we do this so we massage some sort of rewilding, and at the same time as have a more ecological frame and a more responsible and nutrient recovery frame for producing agricultural outputs? How do we pull that off, I suppose, is what we're looking at. And that's what a lot of us are grappling with on a daily basis. So, and the natural sequence farming approach is just one of those. Now, I mentioned before, just before I get into trees, now that I've created, I hope, a bit of a frame for that and where we might put things. I come from an area of Australia which is in the southwest, about 2 hours north of Melbourne, the second largest city in Australia, and is part of the Dja Dja Wurrung people. So the Dja Dja Wurrung have been in this region, we understand, for at least 50,000 years. And it's one of the larger nations in what is now known as the state of Victoria. This is a place that, you know, if you were looking at analogues in Europe, is probably similar in climate to central to northern Spain, parts of, you know, western Catalonia, in that we get 200 to 600 millimeters of rainfall. We've got this, we do have a rainfall distributed over all periods of the year, but majority of the rain falls in the winter and spring, early spring. We have quite cold winters, although not polar winters. We get a lot of frost. We get about 60 frosts a year. But the flip of that is it's Australia, so we have this brutal summer at times. So last summer was brilliant. We had one day over 40, which I've never had in my life. But the year before, the so-called worst summer, we had many, I can't remember, it was 20 or 30 days over 40 degrees. And years ago, when we had a really big fire event in 2009, the so-called Black Saturday, that the temperature in our area rose to 48 degrees, which is Morocco-like. It's a highly diverse agricultural area, and lots and lots of different stuff produced. So, you know, to bring you back to home, there's some significant artifacts which come from this part of the world, which are currently residing in a building in London there, and which relate very much to the connection between the Dja Dja Wurrung and the forest that they nurtured. More recently, in an organisation, so our organisation and this restaurant, we do something called pay the rent, and a few Aboriginal nations and corporations are doing that now, where organisations such as us will pay a proportion of our revenue, or if we're paying a tenancy, a proportion of that to an Aboriginal organisation to say thanks. And to provide some additional support for their traditional ownership and custodianship, which continues to this day. Part of that led to an organisation that we pay the rent to, recovering access to this tree. So they were able to buy this landscape back that was theirs, because they wanted to get access to this very important Eucalyptus malleodora, which is known as a birthing tree. It's a very important tree. It's where women would birth their children. Obviously an important place. It's like a hospital. The other thing about Aboriginal society, and particularly in the southern areas, is this very, this culture, this enduring culture of connection with trees. And you know, so in this part of the world, the average adult would require something like 40 to 45, depending on their stature, 40 to 45 possum skins a year. And so trees were actually, which are the homes of these possums, these marsupials, would be cultivated so that they would be not only a habitat for those possums, but also give the ability for Aboriginals to more easily harvest them. And you can see this in some historical depictions of those possums being hunted. And that was a really key part of their culture. So when we look at, I'm not saying you're going to be possum farmers at all, but when you look forward to what you're doing, I think it's really useful to go back and look at what's been. And here's some early first contact photography, because we're fortunate that photography was around just at the time of some first contact in what were then the colonies of Australia. And the other thing, and this is a photograph I took more recently on the right here, is what's called a canoe or a scar tree. So all throughout this region, it's where, and again, part of the fact that this landscape had a different hydrological function once meant that there was a lot more water in it than there once was. A lot of streams which are now dry for part of the year were permanently running. And that meant that these peoples needed canoes to get out there to do fishing and so on. So all through our district are littered these, with littered is probably not the right word, but a spread, these remnants of this time, which was only 150 or 60 years ago. It's really cool that we've still got that connection, and that you can see these remnants here today. Now, one of the first big jobs I did in the UK was at the Cowdrey estate, which is a 16,000 hectare estate owned by the Viscount and Viscountess Cowdrey, Michael and Marina Pearson. And they've got a tree on there which is called the Queen Elizabeth tree. And that's not Queen Elizabeth II, our current monarch, if I can say that, but Queen Elizabeth I, because she was under or was housed in this tree on a storm one day or something like that. Now, this tree is treated with extraordinary reverence, and I'm going to say it's probably on some sort of national protection register, as it should be. These types of trees, not so. But anyway, that's and that leads us to this type of thing that's been going on, which some of you might have heard about, that, to build a road, lots of these different trees are being removed, even though they have extraordinary significance, as much significance as these trees do, but not to the prevailing majority. Anyway, enough of that. I just wanted to give you that flavour of the context of, in our landscape, how, just as a small piece, how important trees are to the cultures of people, and that extends to the cultures of people in the United Kingdom as well, and elsewhere. So when we look at our landscapes, we've got to look at how we can rehydrate them. Where do we put trees? All of that sort of thing, so that we can manage better the waters that go through them. Trees and water have a very strong link. I mean, they transpire enormous quantities of water, and the absence of them is meaning that the hydrological cycle has been impacted significantly. And then we should also look at it through the lens of how are we actually developing our suburbs and our urban landscapes. And P.A. Yeomans, in his last book, The City Forest, looked at that. About, again, how should we and can we integrate all of these things together so that we can have much more efficient and much more water resilient and much more nutrient resilient landscapes which people find themselves habitating. Right, so when we come down to trees and their fitting in the landscape, some of the considerations, particularly important for those of you who are in higher latitudes, which I think pretty well all of the British Isles are above 40 or 45 degrees of latitude. Also, I can't remember off the top of my head. So, a large part of the year, the sun is at a low angle in the sky. And so when you go planting trees in the landscape, you've got to, and you're trying to do that while integrating them in with agricultural production, then you've got to consider with that what their height's going to be and how much shade they cast. And fortunately, there's some pretty easy ways to do that with some pretty basic trigonometry, for you to be able to go forecast, all right, if I'm going to have a tree that's 10 meters high, or I'm looking at building a hedgerow of this particular height, then if I place it at this particular angle to the sun, maybe east-west as an orientation of that row, then how much of the landscape next to that is going to be impacted by the shade that comes from that? And then what's that going to have as an impact on my bottom line in terms of the crops that I'm growing in there, or the pastures, etc. So there's some very basic considerations that we have. The other thing that we're considering with that is what makes an effective shelter. I mean, a lot of people look at integrating trees into the landscape, not just for all of their biodiversity impacts, but also for their shelter impacts. And in a maritime island, on maritime islands such as those across the British Isles, then this is really important. But it also extends to most landscapes. Most landscapes are affected by wind, and most crops and livestock are also impacted by wind and and suffering exposure. So the introduction of trees into landscapes is only there to help, but there's efficiencies that can be had with that. So the classic English hedgerow, for example, has this form. It starts with hedges with edges, I should say, which are low and go all the way to the ground. And then you get a progressive height, and then you come back down again. That's a classic hedgerow. That actually absorbs a lot of the energy of wind. And so when we look at that kind of profile, that profile can have 10 to 20 times its height in lateral wind protection. So in other words, if you've got a 10-metre high hedgerow which has this type of shape, then that can give wind protection for between 100 and 200 metres laterally, which means that, you know, when you think about that, if you are if you are pressed for productive land, and yet you still want to integrate trees into it, well then considering the way that these shelter belts or hedgerows are constructed or planted, and the species that they're composed with, can minimize the number of those that you need to integrate, in other words, which I think is, you know, in large part, when we have to be practical. I mean, you can't necessarily just go and plant your whole landscape to trees, or just put them willy-nilly without considering your bottom line, and the impacts that will have on forms of other forms, or your mainstay forms of production. Now, that's not to say that these species that we integrate may not also be able to produce, that they don't also produce something that's harvestable. Obviously, that's a potential as well. But then we've also got to look at that through the frame of how we're going to harvest. It's not easy to harvest a shelter belt necessarily. That's why we produce systems with space so that we can do harvesting. We've also got to consider, as we have in the handbook, how we're going to integrate all of it. There's math involved. We've got machinery. We've got existing fences and hedgerows and so on. And if we're going to start to introduce trees or other perennial woody planting systems into our agricultural fields, well then, how's that all going to look? What's the math of all of that? And so we look at the width of the machinery that we're using, the turning radius that this machinery has, and so on, so that we can factor that into our design of how widely spaced trees will be, or rows will be, and where their rows will end, so that we've got sufficient headland, and so on. Another part of this, which Simon touched on, was this potential for carbon sequestration. And carbon sequestration, it's interesting to note that it comes really through in agricultural systems in two ways. One is, and the most easily measured carbon, is that in the woody tissue of woody plants. And so if you are entering into some arrangements, then it's quite easy for you to do that based on the volume of existing trees that you have that are locking up an existing amount of carbon. But if you're putting in new plantings, well, then there's lots and lots of very simple means to be able to measure that carbon as an increment over time, as sequestered in woody biomass. When it comes to soils, it's a different matter. The sequestration of carbon in soils is not as easily measured, but is something that certainly shouldn't be overlooked. And we advise people, if they're looking to enter into these arrangements, is to look at having some sort of soil carbon assay completed, so that they have got that accounted for, such that if they are to enter into agreements in the future, then you have a baseline that you're starting with. And if you're not aware of them, we can share them with you at another time. Different protocols for measuring soil carbon, which are scientifically and verifiable and verified by a range of different carbon markets, which is pretty straightforward. Now, the other thing I wanted to talk about is capability brown, a favourite of mine. As I can see Simon smirking now. It's almost like you can't have a discussion about landscape architecture on agricultural landscapes and trees without talking about this gent, from this extraordinary prolific human who really framed what we think, I would say, in large part, of the English landscape now. I mean, if you look at that gentleman's contemporaries in France at the time, they were all getting very, very rectilinear, and they were what my old friend Bill Mollison called getting into horticulture. The extreme topiary and landscapes with really high levels of constructed geometry, whereas Capability Brown was looking at creating landscapes which looked like they were natural, when the planting arrays, the species planted, were from all over the world, because this coincided with he was working when the British Empire was almost at its zenith, and all of the species of the world that could be cultivated here were cultivated, both in greenhouses and out in fields. So you've got this landscape archetype that a lot of people will look to with nostalgia as being something that's desirable. But when we also look at it, I look at that and go, well, yeah, it's really beautiful, but how practical is it? Because a lot of these landscapes were established by people who had money from the colonies, simple as that. So this is like an extension of the ability to not necessarily run estates which, off their own bat, were highly highly productive agriculturally, because there was all of this other money coming from India or wherever else that was propping these estates up. So the nostalgia for what we've got here is really important, and these landscapes are astoundingly beautiful, but are they the landscapes that are going to suit us? And this is why I wanted to start with this point. It's really important for you in your expression onto your landscapes to understand what you want it to look like. You're going to have to live with it for however many years. How's it going to look? And that's where some of today's technologies can help. This is a landscape that currently only that road exists. This is my colleague Georgie Pavlov, who works with me at Regrarians, my partner. He does digital renderings of landscapes for people who work with us, so that they can see what the future will look like potentially. And he can swap this out so that there's different looks for different landscapes. So very similar to what a lot of people will do now. I mean, if you watch a Kevin McLeod show where he's going in and he forecasts what a house will look like, and you can walk through it through some sort of digital rendering. I mean, all of that sort of thing is really wonderful. We can now do that on a whole landscape level. So one of the examples here is this property in Western Australia, down near the famous Margaret River region. This is a client who has extensive vineyards, and they also have, as part of those landscapes, they have outblocks which are not suited to growing vines, and so they're in grazing. And this particular block at the moment has no trees on it at all. It's completely void of trees. And so they were looking at, all right, well, how might we integrate trees into this, and what's it going to look like? Because to them, when we've had this conversation, they've gone, yeah, well, you know, trees really frame a landscape. What sort of look do we want to have them? But at the same time, how are we going to do that and make a buck on this, right? How's it going to be agriculturally productive? And so when we looked at this landscape, we gave two options. We gave what we call the shelter belt option, which is the one that was there before. Shelter belts, as you can see, north-south, it's a pretty flat site, so there's no advantage to having a contour alignment with the trees. We've put some trees in riparian or wet areas, which are in block plantings. And then we've got these various alley plantings. And then there were some areas where we felt it wasn't as suitable to put the alleys for a variety of reasons. And so we decided to look at more of a savanna style planting, which is not that different to this. I mean, I would call that a sort of a savanna style of layout, which humans love all over the world. So when I've shown these two diagrams all over the world, and I say, which one would you like the most? Most people go, yeah, I think I would like that. Or I think that really appeals to me because it looks like a park, right? And who doesn't want to have a park, right? But then when I say, all right, well, which one is going to be more agriculturally productive? They go, yeah, with livestock and electric fencing and managing all that. Then they go, yeah, well, I think the shelter belt layout's going to be the better one, the hedgerow layout. And there's no surprise there that when we had the Enclosure Acts enacted in the UK way back when, that in large part led to the hedgerow system. And the reason for that was because not only it enclosed land, but it also made it really much easier and much more practical for that other thing that rose around that time, which was the concept of rotation of crops and rotation of livestock. It makes it a lot more easily done when you actually got that within a frame. When you put that into a more savanna landscape, it's not as simple because the savanna is not as well framed. So there's some of the considerations. Another island that the Brits have had a bit of fun with over the journey is Menorca. And this is the southern coast of Menorca on a client's property. And it's a pretty barren chaparral of, the shrub there is one of the pistachios, and there's various little shrub oaks and this sort of thing on a really shallow soil site. And so the client here was saying, all right, well, what's this going to look like? And when you're talking all this stuff, but what's it going to look like? We go, well, maybe it might look like this. So we've put olive trees and holm oaks and we put some cattle in there. It's exactly the same landscape, but just through the action of digital rendering, we've been able to give a vision as to what things might look like in the future. And this is a landscape which is very familiar to a lot of people in Iberia, which is the Dehesa, or in Portugal, the so-called Montado. These wide-spaced tree systems which are pastoral and where there's not rocks everywhere can also grow crops and so on. So other systems, this is, believe it or not a digital rendering. This is one of our clients' properties that I established in 1999, 2000, Campbell and Julie Mercer at a place called Mount Egerton. It's a 140-acre property. And these people are tree people. So we put in an agroforestry system of olives at 8-metre row spacings, 5-metre tree spacings. And Campbell and Julie run chickens and sheep in between the olives in rotation. But then on some parts of that landscape, as you can see, there's that block of planting with the mixed foliage colours. That's a agroforestry block. So that's a farm forestry block of high prune timber. So you can see the trees, at least on the outside, have been pruned up so that they will have value, and they already do, as timber for furniture making and so on, and for firewood. So Campbell's got this whole diverse range of species across here. So that's an expression of someone who is a tree person, right? Not all of you listening to this are tree people. You don't want to have a tree-based agriculture. Campbell did want to, right? Other people may want to have more of a more livestock people, or a more mixed crop people, cropping people, etc. So how are you going to integrate in? And that's where we still decide, well, if there's parts of the landscape which have lower capabilities, well, then we'll integrate trees into them, and so on. Or we'll go with hedgerows, or we'll go with this and that, as we've discussed. This is another project that I designed and developed. This is Geelong Grammar School, which is one of the most famous schools in this country. Prince Charles went there for 1 year in 1966. He was sent out here and went up to Timbertop, its country estate training school. And in this case, this is and the adjacent Shell oil refinery. They also own a whole lot of agricultural land. They wanted to set up a landscape which had a lot better environmental outcomes, had a lot better shelter, because it was extreme. I mean, it's a coastal environment. It's highly exposed. So we put in these 3 tree belts every 60 metres, following those directives that I provided earlier in terms of the metrics of how this is all integrated. And that's worked tremendously well. And I was just back down there recently. I did all of this in 1998, 9 and 2000. I planted over 50,000 trees across about 500 hectares. And we went back there. We've just started going back down there to look at the next steps of this evolution of this plan, which is really cool, and sort of goes to that concept that I mentioned earlier, that, these things don't stop, they continue. You've got evolution. We've got a whole new group of administrators, of teachers, of students, and so on, who have a whole different kind of outlook as far as all of this is concerned. But it's been really well framed, which is great. What's going on here? Other systems that we've developed. This is one of Michael Wright's, and he is another person who is developing, who wanted a very mixed system, but wanted to have a lot of areas open. So we developed this more of a block planting outlook. And that type of outlook was integrated so that the trees were put on areas of the property which had lower land capability for agriculture. So all of the areas that are open have a higher capability for grazing, and that's what goes on there. This is a property I mentioned earlier, 500 acre, 200 hectare pig property. So we set this all up. It's on a granitic landscape which gets very wet in winter. This landscape produces about 4,000 pigs a year. And they're killed off-site and butchered and made into small goods and whatnot on-site. And so we developed this whole road network, and we're progressively integrating, as you can see, trees into this landscape. We fenced it all using keyline geometry, and the pigs never spend any more than a couple of days on any given area. There's a complete and full movement of pigs across this property at all times. The pigs are farrowed outside. They spend their whole lives outside. It's a really, really great project. And unusually for pigs, which, as I said before, and anyone who's worked with pigs would know, they're a pretty aggressive animal on the landscape. Unusually for them in these systems, unfortunately, we've still been able to increase biodiversity in the pastures. we've actually seen a return of native perennial species and so on. So it's a really exciting set of outcomes that we've seen there. So when it comes to establishing trees, there's lots of different ways to do it. We've developed a lot of organic methods to do that, ones that don't use the usual tool of herbicide. We sometimes do mounds to immediately increase the drainage available. We sometimes use patterns of placement of rows to manipulate and control water flows and increase survival rates and so on. We often use machines to plant, whether that's me in that photo with that burgundy spear. That's called a potapukki, which is a planting spear, a device from Finland. Or we're using retired vegetable planters, which we've been able to modify very easily to plant trees. You can, with an old vegetable planter, like that's a 40-year-old planter, we're able to plant with 3 people and a 25 horsepower tractor, 10,000 trees a day. So, you can plant a lot, provided that you've got the ground preparation. And then take it through those steps. Some of the things that we're doing, which are really innovative in this space, and this is working with one of my students, Gautier Grass, who's a consultant to the French Agroforestry Association, is doing things like strip cropping, which some of you would already be familiar with. And we're starting to use this same method of narrow band cultivation as a possibility for tree establishment. Because, one of the challenges with tree establishment, particularly in temperate areas, is weed competition. If you've got grasses like fescues, for example, and phalaris and other, really strong perennial grasses, which and cocksfoot, etc., that are really, really tough to be able to establish trees into. So we use either wider band cultivation or narrow band cultivation to help us with that, and time it and grow cover crops to replace those grasses and so on. And do that in a frame as well, as Gautier has done, to actually grow commercial crops as well. One of my students, Francisco Alves, who is in Portugal. This is a current photo. It looks like an old historic photo, but this is just a beautiful photo of some of the activities that occur and can occur in forests. Unfortunately, the UK is not a great place for growing cork oak, but there are a whole range of different products which Simon intimated earlier that we can consider when integrating trees. And as Francisco put here, with his pig meat from his black pigs dining on acorns, is that this is not for sale to Bill Gates. Which I don't know exactly what that means, but his perspective is that this is not artificial meat. This is real meat grown on real landscapes, and something that a laboratory could never produce. And a laboratory could never produce all of the ecosystem and social outcomes that we're seeing here. So that's what I wanted to leave us with, and as a vision, and thank all of these other people for their images, which I should do. And oops, that one went too quickly. And if you've got any questions, then feel free to ask. I expect that we'll just do that with the normal Zoom thing. And if you've got a microphone, then you can do that. So if you've got any questions, fire away.
That's great, Darren. Thank you so much.
Maybe put your hand up, I think, is the best thing.
Yeah, there's a hand raise function which is super helpful. It might be nice if you can turn your camera on as well, Darren. You can see your mug again.
Oh yes, yeah. Thanks. I don't know if I want to do that to people. But,
it's quite nice to see Francisco's on the slide there. We were in Portugal earlier this year. We went to go and see him. And he's a charming young man who gave us the time to show us around his land, which has been in his family for generations. And it was really inspiring to see the kind of health of the land, which kind of he's been nurturing through the kind of holistic system, and combining that with this kind of ancient way of the cork oak. And indeed, when we were there, similar guys were harvesting, and it's hard work, but they seem to be really enjoying it, and they stopped for lunch and cold beers when we were there. So yeah, it was good.
Yeah, the time of cork harvest is it's amazing how many people are there doing it, and you've always got an older person working with a younger person, and then you've got the food that goes with that. And it's fun. It's interesting that when we look at, and I often talk about the parallel outcomes of the Spanish-English wars of the Middle Ages, and that Spain had to remove all of its trees, and because it's dry, they didn't grow back very well. Whereas England, because it's more temperate, it's really hard for trees to not grow in that landscape. So it's interesting that parts of Spain have never recovered, but because of the climate of the British Isles, they will always recover. But we try and quell that by growing, I would say, too many arable crops and keeping too many animals inside. But that's my opinion.
Sure. Thanks for that. There's a question in the chat from Martin.
Yep, Martin. Yep.
Speaking about the layers, the ordering frameworks.
Yep. I'll just get Martin on the call here. The role of biodiversity in the layers. Hey there, Martin.
Hello there. How are you doing?
Yeah, good, mate.
Good.
Look, could you just maybe frame that a bit better for me? Oh, sorry, it's better for me, not you've probably done an adequate job for you.
I'll try. I'll try.
Yeah.
I suppose it comes down to some questions around interventions in the landscape to improve agricultural productivity as an excellent aim. Mm-hmm. But can it be an aim to improve perhaps a different sort of agricultural productivity that also has other benefits, like the value of nature and the value of biodiversity?
Oh, absolutely. And I think, this is a really tough topic, especially in a short period to get every outcome across, because there are so many outcomes. But like I'll put it in the frame of our thing. When we go through the Regrarians Platform and we start with having people outline their context, I would say that 95% of the time biodiversity is mentioned as something that people want to increase. Now, that's perhaps a reflection of the people who come to us and work with us, right? Because we're known as we're in that space. But even when I talk to people who are outside of our networks, who are perhaps more conventional producers, when you sit down and have a chat with them about it, they go, "Yeah, I would love to see more nature," right? And then you start to explore, well, what does nature mean to you, and what are those outcomes? And then you start to talk about, well, what's the role of the hedgerows that you put in, and the insectivorous birds that they create habitat for, and
Sure.
so on. And then that's, the light bulbs start to go off on that. And then you start to look at, well, this whole engagement with insects. We've done an enormous job to get rid of insects, and we wonder why all of the little birds that are missing. It's like, well, where's their food source gone? It's like, you've got to put it all together. So it was really interesting to me to watch, and it'll probably make people shudder to some extent, Jeremy Clarkson's series on Amazon, where here is someone who, well, clearly doesn't have much of an ecological umbilical at all, is going through a year. And when I watched that, I was watching it as an observer of how people respond to the development and management of their landscapes, and how someone like him, when I looked at it, I thought, gee, actually, this guy's turned on mostly by some of the nature stuff that he's just never considered before.
Yeah.
And I don't think that's something that I've observed quite a lot of over the journey with people who are, let's say, rather conventional or not normally attracted to that kind of thinking.
And your model can capture that, do you think?
Absolutely. It's central to it. I think, you know, if you're going to have, we have, well, in my opinion, and this is my opinion, and I will always allow people to make their own minds up. Like I said, we're utterly self-determinist, but in my opinion and experience, it's very important to embrace the available biodiversity that we have, so that it can help support agricultural production as well as the broader environment. There's more than ample evidence of it not being a conflict, or in conflict, I should say.
Yeah, lovely. Yeah, thanks very much.
My pleasure. Thank you. Thanks for spending the time.
Okay. And there's one there from Gail, just come in.
Okay.
You can read that, or Gail, if you want to unmic. And
Gail Verdi. Yeah. Hello, Gail.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes.
How are you?
That was a very interesting talk. You covered a hugely wide range of topics, and all of them fascinating. Looking at the layers that you mentioned, they were all designed for people who already own the land, but in our case, there's land that's owned by somebody else that we would like to do something like, you know, some of your suggestions on it. But
Yep.
have a layer. The first layer should be overcoming opposition, or getting permission, or, you know, cancelling out the government plans for development on that particular land, for example.
Well, that's what we include. I haven't gone into the full depth of our layers because we've obviously spent a bit of time on them over the last decade. But we look at the climate layer, so the climate of regulation, the climate of the culture of who you're dealing with. So the climate layer is the climate of everything as far as we're concerned.
Oh, I see.
It's the starting condition, and it's the starting place. That's why it's the first layer. So
I didn't understand that's what you meant by climate.
Yeah, exactly. So it's not just, you know, how much it rains and how hot and cold it is. It's really, you know, about you and what you want to achieve, but then what you can achieve, because, you know, as you've just made clear, I mean, if you don't own the land, which is still a really big thing in the UK, you know, feudalism is still well and truly alive there, that you're likely to be a tenant farmer. And so, you know, it's not, all of the decisions are not for you to make, just as they aren't anyway, even if you do own the land, because you've got regulations which some people find anathema. So yeah, but you do need to know. That's why, well, the way I frame it is that in our layers, the climate is frames the rules of the game, if we can call it a game, and the geography is the board game. You know, so is it snakes and ladders, or is it chess, or is it Monopoly? You know, or, you know, what does the terrain look like? But then, what are the rules of how we're going to engage with that terrain? That's some of those are rules that we define, but then some of those are rules that have already been defined for us, or other people's, you know, other individuals' rules who have different levels of power in the play.
I didn't interpret climate to have that scope, but thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate you giving me the opportunity to explain that scope. It's like I said, it's a short talk. We have a whole, in our program, we have 3 weeks of our program, which is just devoted to climate and climate issues, because it is so foundational and important.
Yeah, thank you.
My pleasure. Thank you. Thanks for being with us.
Thanks, Gail. And one from Paul's just come in. Paul,
Paul, I'll see if I can.
Can you hear me all right?
Oh, hi, Paul. How are you?
Very good, very good. Thanks so much for that. I mean, I don't know if my question makes much sense that I've sort of put there.
Yeah.
I mean, one of the things that I'm heavily involved in is some of the new stewardships that are trying to be created. And we know that one of the issues that's arisen is it's being very much put on the landowners, the farmers, those that are at the hard face of it, those guys that you're working with, to actually come up with, you know, what are the improvements they're going to make? How can they add value? How can they improve all of the things that you're talking about?
Mm-hmm.
And it's then we talk about baseline layers, we talk about different ways of calculating things, etc.
Mm-hmm.
But it's then actually showing how does that equate to some of the things that we're trying to achieve. And I just wondered if there's, I'm not expecting you to rattle off numbers or amounts, etc., but how comfortable and confident are you that there are those parameters that we can hang hats on to enable some of that to actually make some meaningful progress from what you've been involved with?
Yeah, it's a great question. Thanks, Paul, and thanks for being with us. Look, I think in terms, like you've said here, in terms of organic matter, look, that's going to vary. If I was to talk in the tropics, for example, then, well, I'll talk soil organic carbon to differentiate that from organic matter. The soil organic carbon levels of 15 to 17% because of the high leaching faculty of intense summer rainfall and high temperatures are where you want to be. But when you come into the temperates, you know, sort of like the 6 to 8-9% soil organic carbon and at depth is what we're kind of looking at, because if we go higher than that, then that can cause some agronomic nutrient ties up and so on. So, and it can start to, which is a problem particularly in quite humid landscapes, of impacting drainage as well. So, you know, and then we get back to where we sort of started, and, you know, you look at so much of the UK and Europe and the United States and even over here in Australia was drained because the starting point was a landscape which had pretty high levels of carbon, of soil carbon. And so, and then as soon as we started to degrade soil structure, well, then that caused our landscapes to drain poorly, and so we needed to drain them. So there's that sort of thing. Those are the sort of levels that we might be looking at from that perspective. When it comes to biodiversity, I mean, biodiversity it can start with the pasture species that you have. But again, you know, as I think you would more than realise, just having a biodiverse pasture doesn't mean you're going to make money out of that pasture as a pasture alone. Is that kind of where you're getting to? You know, you've got to perhaps have some other frames of support through the ecosystem values that gives to the broader community.
What's the best way of putting it? I think, you know, in terms of a lot of what happens out on the land, there's probably an acceptance that it's not, yes, there's sort of not losing money, but in a way there's not necessarily money that often or that always needs to be made from it in every situation, because actually money is being made in other areas, and therefore it's almost that's part of what's being put back, which is an element of where we're going around with this sort of carbon credits, nitrate credits, you know, a lot of the stuff that's happening in the markets, etc. at the moment anyway. I suppose the angle I was as much coming up from was where you talk about rivers and erosion. We know that, you know, levels of soil organic matter, the higher the soil organic matter, the more it obviously holds, the less likely you are to have erosion, and therefore temperate climates, yes, is going to be different from Amazon, but we know we've got erosion going on in both. So I suppose it's in a way, it's just the simple science that goes behind, and that, you know, agriculture has been slightly devoid of. It's sort of, you know, it's almost run ahead, and science is trying to catch up, and now science is probably more at the fore, but it's trying to integrate the science with the functionality of farming and agriculture. And I suppose there's an element of that you're obviously bringing together. I just wondered if the science and the numbers, whether there's more that we can do with scientists and farmers being integrated, and whether that's something you're, you know, seeing more of, or think need to be championed more of as part of what we're trying to achieve.
I think there needs to be more of it, and that is happening, but quite slowly, because agricultural sciences, like most sciences, have become have increased in their numbers of disciplines, and become more and more disintegrated and more specialized. And so for conventionally trained scientists to then go and look at something that actually needs to be, that is very holistic and highly integrated, is a challenge, and we're finding that. But by the same token, what's really exciting is that there's a lot of work being done in, such as with the Savory Institute and their ecosystem outcomes verification protocols, which I find really fascinating, because it's looking at outcomes as opposed to inputs, which has been something that most people have been focusing on, both in organic agriculture and in conventional agriculture for a long time. It's all about framing what inputs are there, as opposed to looking at what are the outcomes. And I think that that's a much more practical and pragmatic approach, because it says that you don't have to put your tools away, because it's really hard for people in their transitions. I mean, agriculture is a really tough game financially. So we don't want to make it any harder than it needs to be by bringing, perhaps, let's say, ideology into this, that thou shall not spray, or thou shall not do this, or thou shall not do that, as opposed to saying, all right, let's have a frame where outcomes are important and they're what you're being rewarded for, as opposed to just saying, don't use it, I'll tie one hand behind your back so that you can't get to where you want. So there's that, and I think that the monitoring around that has been, and the monitoring science that's come from that has been really, really fascinating. And part of it has come from an existing field which has been around for a long time, and that's ecological restoration. The ecological restoration movement, or discipline of ecological restoration, has provided a lot of support to this frame of monitoring. The other point I'd make too, Paul, is that one of the things that we spend a lot of time on in this space is trying to reduce people's costs. And that's why part of what I meant by big M management before. When people take, like, one of the things that we do as a starting point is bring people back down to what, you know, to the core of them and their enterprise, and we'll look at the books and we'll see where the bleeds are. We'll look at, we look at the ecological bleeds, but we also look at the financial bleeds, and that starts to allow us then to strategize as to what the value those bleeds are giving. And some of that might be fertilizer management, some of that might be the way that they're marketing different things, and so on, all of that. So what we'll do is try and pinpoint that so that we can run a much leaner operation, or help them to run a much leaner operation, which has a lower input cost, because it's sometimes easier and more rewarding in a quicker time frame to reduce input costs and spend more time on management than it is to do the usual thing, which is, that old saying, you have to spend money to make money. It's not necessarily the case. Yeah, you have to spend money. If you're going to spend money on something that's actually going to make money, and not just make it this year, but make it for many, many years to come. And so often what we've been doing is we've been spending money on inputs which are going to, give us a yield for this year or maybe another 2, but not give us outcomes for financial outcomes that are positive for years in advance. So yeah, it's a big question, this one, and I think part of it too is we're entering a brave new world of all of these other forms of income that can come to agriculture through the agency of ecosystem services payments. So it's very exciting, but what the metrics are, we're still trying to understand, but there's certainly people doing that. I hope that's helped, Paul. If I haven't, then please let me know. We'll continue.
Spot on. Very good.
Thank you, Darren.
Thanks, mate.
Okay, any other questions from anyone? Anyone dying to ask anything on their mind? This might be your last chance.
Well,
Darren's a hard man to get hold of, being the time difference is hard enough.
No, that's all right.
We've had a few.
I'm a morning person, so it was no trouble at all for me.
It's nice to see the light coming through your windows now.
Yeah, it is. Yeah. I'll start photosynthesizing now myself.
Excellent, great. Well, I mean, in that case, we'll probably start to wrap up, given that it's getting close to 9:30 anyway, which is great. Mm-hmm. I'll just one reflection. You talked about the riparian kind of corridors as being this potential for these nutrient absorbing and kind of wildlife corridors. And I think, you know, for this park, we've had a lot of calls from the public workshops for rewilding, and you know, a lot of experienced people are kind of speaking to that, and this idea of kind of rewilding the river corridor. So yeah, it's just interesting to pick up on that, and also to say to people that we've got another talk in a couple of weeks on the 20th of October. We've got a gentleman talking to us from a project in Holland where they rewilded the Geldersport, the Millinga Ward project. So Wouter Helmer is coming to talk. I'll just stick our website in the chat, and you can get tickets for that. That'll be quite interesting as well. Darren, you might want to finish up with a couple of words on the riparian zone. And
sure.
Like,
well, I think is my screen still sharing?
Yeah,
it is. Yeah, yeah. Look, it's a hard one. I love the whole concept of rewilding. I've been following that narrative for I'm going to say the better part of 20 years or so, because we've had that. Well, maybe under a different frame, that narrative going around for some time. I mean, I even go back to when I was a teenager in the 80s, and the sort of Earth First movement, which, you know, is the most extreme version of that, which is where humans are hated and they'd love to be removed from the landscape altogether, right through to, you know, various levels of moderation of that kind of view. And look, for me, it's got to a point where I think that humans have sort of almost beating themselves up about the adverse impacts that they've had on this planet, such that from a land planning perspective, it becomes there's lines that delineate our involvement or not, and certainly. I think that there's some areas that once they're developed in a way are best viewed as opposed to managed, best touched by humans. But then you know, we've got the problem that there's a lot of us, and we've still got to feed ourselves, and we also, it's good to get in and go into these systems so that we can see them and we can learn from them and understand them and spread the learnings that we get from them. So, you know, sort of removing ourselves from zones altogether is something that I struggle with at times, and reflect on often. So, but I think that it's clear to me that when we look at, as I'll look at this slide here, for example, particularly the bottom part of it, that when we're looking at a landscape, where the kind of easy parts to start, and this is often what's reflected in grants that are given as well, are the riparian corridors. I mean, one of the first things that a lot of places do is they'll give you grants to fence off riparian areas, and hallelujah. These are nutrient corridors. They're more often than not zones of relatively low agricultural capability, either because they're channelized or because the soils are heavy, prone to flooding and inundation and stuff. So the risks to agriculture and agricultural production outweigh the rewards. So why not fence it off and or separate it out and help it on its way to being something wild again? There's enormous benefits to that. So that seems a no-brainer to me, just as it is doing the same up on hills and whatnot. But it's this area in between that is where most agriculture and most agriculturally capable land is. But then there's that. But then, you know, when we look at this as a landscape, if that ridge line continues and this flow line continues along here, you know, this riparian strip, well, then you've got valleys which come up into that as well. You know, the landscape is made up of dendritic patterns of water flow. So you've got ridges and valleys which all connect up, and so it's connect up to these higher ridges and so on. So the riparian areas aren't necessarily just, you know, down on the classic creek or river systems, but they should also and can also extend up into the valleys as well. And so in so doing, then create this union, this landscape union with the main ridges that we have in the landscape as well, such that we have varying levels of tree and shrub cover, which then allow biodiversity a place to do its work, while at the same time we've got all of these areas in between that we can practice agriculture, and that, you know, following on from a few people's points, that then we can have an integration between, or an association with the biodiversity whose homes are in the trees, with the landscapes that are in between. But then, if we can, also promote their lives out here by having husbandry practices and stewardship practices of agriculture, which in themselves promote that. I mean, just to make that point, I mean, something like this form of cropping, this strip cropping, allows us to maintain pastures at the same time as grow cereals. Now, that then provides homes for things where ordinarily when we grow cereals, we just get rid of the whole lot. There's no home for anyone apart from an annual crop every season or however often. It's just a wasteland of nothingness. Whereas you start doing techniques like this, and you've still got the ability to grow arable or crops of arable agriculture at the same time as provide a home and cover and infiltration for others. So, you know, there's lots of different things that people are doing that allow us to have a bit of both in the broader frame.
Wonderful, thank you. And also, I once heard you refer to those kind of those riparian kind of sub-valleys, as it were, as the biological corridors or conduits of life. You know, just that in those places they are so alive, and in a way, you know, if we focus some energies on restoring those, it's a kind of nice easy win, I guess.
Well, that's right. You know, even when you look at these photos on here, I mean, this property is obviously not developed as far as I could see. You know, you've always got these edges like here. You know, what's happening there? Why is that a wasteland right now? right? As you might say. Well, why not? If that is the way, and even along here, you can see here, and it's a fence line. It's not really doing much. There's already a bit of stuff growing there. Well, why wouldn't you get that up and growing, right? And connect that in with the riparian corridors and so on, so that we can just get a lot more life happening, because we need more life. I mean, I don't know if anyone's looked under the hood lately, but there is less and less life all the time, especially wildlife. So let's get it back. Let's give it a home. I mean, that's the least we can bloody do.
Yeah, well said. Thank you, Darren. That's fabulous. Well, if anyone wants to reach out to Darren, feel free to get in touch or get in touch with us, and we can connect you up, or check out his Agrarians Platform. It's well worth having a membership, particularly if you're in the land industry or a landowner or farmer, smallholder. Very good network, fully supported, a lot of resources, an amazing training program. So yeah, I couldn't recommend it highly enough. And you just had a very, very, very light taster of that this evening. I hope you've all found it as interesting as I have, the depth and the breadth with which Darren's kind of shared his wisdom with us. I've really appreciated, so I hope you all have too. And
well, thank you. Thanks for the opportunity, and thanks for everyone who was able to join us and on the recording as well. All the best with the project.
Great. Thank you so much. Cheers, everyone.
No worries. Thank you.